I can still recall the exact moment I fell in love. Sunlight filtered through the windows of her parents' summer home, casting a warm glow across the room. My own reflection flickered on the polished wooden floors as I stood there, taking it all in. I grew up in a modest household, the kind where the scent of freshly laundered clothes mixed with the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals. She, on the other hand, belonged to a world of luxury. Sleek cars, extravagant galas, and wealthy acquaintances who greeted you with polite smiles while making it clear you didn't belong. But that day, none of it mattered. Her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled, the dreams she shared so freely. I was convinced that love could overcome any divide. "Can you stay a little longer?" she asked, her voice soft as we sat together on a park bench near her family's estate. Her name, carved into the bench's paint from when she was a child, was a quiet reminder of the life she had always known. My upbringing couldn't have been more different. I came from a neighborhood where people leaned over chain-link fences to chat, where my father, a retired teacher, and my mother, a part-time baker, raised me in a home without excess but never without enough. Her family would never understand that. "I've got an early shift at the sporting goods store," I told her. She let out a small sigh, leaning against me. "I just hate it when you have to leave," she murmured. In that moment, feeling her warmth, nothing else seemed to matter. I didn't care about the dust on my worn-out shoes or the fact that I was wearing last year's jeans. I believed she loved me regardless. But as our relationship deepened, so did my awareness of her parents. Eleanor carried herself with an effortless grace, but she had a way of silencing an entire room with just a look. Richard, my future father-in-law, may not have been tall, but his presence loomed large, his offhand comments often straddling the line between casual remarks and thinly veiled threats. They tolerated me for her sake, but they never pretended to see me as their equal. The night we announced our engagement, Richard shook my hand with a stiff grip. "Congratulations," he said. "We're happy for you both." "Thank you, sir," I replied. "Just Richard is fine," he corrected me, before adding with a measured pause. "We'll see how all this works out." That last sentence lingered in my mind, the words repeating like an echo I couldn't shake. "We'll see how all this works out." A chill ran through me, though I tried to ignore it, choosing instead to focus on the way my fiancé beamed beside me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that, to them, I was an outsider trespassing in their world. A few days later, we visited her parents' home to set a wedding date. Eleanor and Richard sat us down at their gleaming mahogany dining table, the air between us tense but controlled. Richard slid a folder across the surface. "There's something I need you to sign," he said. Inside was a prenuptial agreement. The document made it clear that any inheritance, trust funds, properties, or businesses from her family would remain solely hers. Meanwhile, anything we acquired together, whether it be a home, a business, or, strangely enough, lottery winnings, would be considered marital property. The section detailing financial windfalls and gains was suspiciously thorough, as if they'd singled out the possibility of some massive jackpot scenario. My name was buried within paragraphs of legal jargon. The prospective spouse consents to. "Is this really necessary?" I asked, my voice measured. Eleanor's response was smooth, effortless. "It's standard in families like ours," she said. "You understand." I turned to my fiancée, searching her expression for reassurance. But she stood slightly apart, her face unreadable. "It's not a big deal," she finally said. "My parents just want to protect family assets. This won't change anything between us." I should have fought harder, but I was too in love to push back. I told myself it wasn't worth the argument. If my feelings for her were real, then signing a few papers wouldn't change that. So I pressed the pen to the page, my signature binding me to an agreement I barely understood. As I finished signing, Richard watched me with a slight smirk, something halfway between satisfaction and amusement. "Welcome to the family," he said. 6 months later, we had the kind of wedding most people only see in magazines. A stunning lakeside venue, floral arrangements flown in from overseas, a 5-tier cake, and a live orchestra. My parents, more accustomed to quiet gatherings and backyard celebrations, were overwhelmed by the sheer extravagance of it all. My father, dressed in his best suit, looked out of place among the elegantly dressed guests who seemed more curious than congratulatory. So, distant relatives would ask him, "How exactly did your son meet her?" Despite the underlying tension, the wedding photos captured nothing but joy, beaming smiles, golden sunlight, and a bride who looked breathtaking in lace. And in that moment, I felt unstoppable, convinced that love was strong enough to bridge any divide. After the wedding, we moved into a sleek condominium that Richard referred to as a gift. In reality, he had covered the down payment, but I was expected to handle the monthly mortgage payments. He never framed it as a demand, just a casual expectation. "You'll cover the monthly bills, right, son?" he asked. And just like that, it was settled. I told myself it was fine, but deep down I knew I wasn't just paying for a home. I was paying rent on a space he still controlled. In the first few years, we had the usual disagreements, arguments over money, frustration over her parents' constant interference. Eleanor and Richard would drop by unannounced, sometimes bringing furniture that clashed with my tastes or rearranging the living room because their decorator thought it looked better another way. Whenever I voiced my frustration, my wife would brush it off. "They're just trying to help," she'd say. I started noticing a pattern. Every part of our life seemed to be shaped by their choices, their control. But I told myself all couples had issues with in-laws. This was just another thing we'd work through. Then, one afternoon, I got a call at work. My wife's voice was trembling with excitement. "You won't believe this," she said breathlessly. "What happened?" I asked, my heart already racing. "I just won the lottery." I nearly dropped my phone. "Wait, what?" "I swear, it's real. $9 million. She had bought a ticket on a whim at a gas station, and every number had matched. That's incredible," I managed, my voice catching. My mind immediately spun with possibilities: early retirement, travel, maybe even giving back through charitable projects. We had always joked about what we'd do if we ever hit it big. I dreamed of helping my parents, buying a house free from Richard's control, maybe even starting my own business. The excitement made my hands shake. Life was about to change in a way I'd never imagined. But as the initial thrill faded, something felt off. My wife grew strangely secretive about the money. She insisted we keep it quiet, especially from my family. She started mentioning meetings with lawyers I'd never heard of, saying they were necessary to handle the claim properly. "Shouldn't I go with you?" I asked one evening. She shook her head, brushing me off. "These attorneys specialize in large estates. You'd feel out of place. I'll fill you in afterward." That stung more than I cared to admit. In the weeks that followed, I found myself increasingly shut out. Whenever I asked about the lottery money, how we'd manage it, whether we'd finally pay off the condo, she waved me off. "It's complicated," she would say, her tone growing sharper each time. One dreary afternoon, exhausted from pulling a double shift at the sporting goods store, all I wanted was to collapse onto the couch. But as I stepped into the condo, I found my wife and her Aunt Margaret rifling through drawers, packing things into boxes. Confused, I asked, "What's going on?" My wife straightened, her face unreadable. Then, with no hesitation, she said, "I'm filing for divorce. Pack your things. I want you gone tonight." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Aunt Margaret, tall and sharp-eyed, surveyed me with clear disapproval. "The condo is in her name, bought with her father's money," she said. "You have no right to stay here." I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what was happening. The woman I had loved, the same one who had just won millions, was kicking me out. "Please," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "Can we at least talk about this?" My wife's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll have my lawyer contact you," she said, her tone as cold as I'd ever heard it. "Now leave before we call security." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. For years I had paid half the mortgage, yet she acted as if the place had never been ours, only hers. I grabbed a bag, stuffing it with whatever essentials I could. Some clothes, a toothbrush, my wallet, And then, without another word, I walked out the door. In the span of minutes, my entire life had unraveled. Shaken, I drove to my parents' house. My father opened the door, his face instantly tightening with concern at the sight of me standing there with a duffel bag and a hollow expression. "What happened?" he asked. I struggled to find the words. Finally, I choked out, "She won the lottery." Then she filed for divorce and kicked me out. My mother let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. My father's jaw clenched, anger flickering beneath the surface, but he remained level-headed. He stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. That night, while my mother ranted about the arrogance and cruelty of my in-laws, my father took a more measured approach. Though his frustration was obvious, he kept his focus on the next steps. "You need a lawyer," he said. "We need to see exactly how that prenup affects things." I buried my face in my hands. "That's the problem," I groaned. "Her parents made sure it was ironclad. I bet it leaves me with nothing." My father paused for a moment, then shook his head. "We don't know that yet. Let's find out." 2 days later, I sat in a small law office, sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the desk of my father's old friend, Mr. Bennett, a family law attorney. I slid the prenuptial agreement across to him, explaining how Richard and Eleanor had insisted on it, how they had made sure every family asset remained solely hers. Carlson flipped through the pages, scanning the dense legal language. Then, to my surprise, he let out a quiet chuckle. "They shot themselves in the foot," he said. My heart leapt with cautious hope. "What do you mean?" He tapped a paragraph with his pen. "They made sure to protect inherited wealth, trust funds, and gifts from her family. But they also added a clause specifying that any windfall gained during the marriage counts as joint property. That includes lottery winnings, unless specifically excluded, which it wasn't." I blinked, barely able to process what he was saying. "Wait, that's actually in there?" He nodded. "Yep. They were so focused on keeping you away from their estate that they forgot to account for this." He closed the document and met my eyes. "Unless a judge interprets this in some bizarre way, you're entitled to a significant portion of that money." Relief and anger collided in my chest. On one hand, I was furious that they had tried to cast me aside so easily. But on the other hand, I realized something important. I wasn't powerless. Not long after, rumors started circulating. My wife wasn't exactly keeping a low profile. Word spread quickly that she had been seen around town with an old coworker named Jason. Jason had worked with her years ago at a marketing firm, and somehow, after all this time, they had reconnected, conveniently right around the moment she won the lottery. When I mentioned it to my mother, she frowned. "You think she was cheating?" I shrugged, my stomach twisting. "I don't know, but it sure looks that way, doesn't it?" An image flashed in my mind. My wife, once so gentle and devoted, now running around with this ex-coworker, flush with cash. Was that the real reason she was so quick to push me out? I filed the thought away. I was already dealing with the divorce, with losing my home. If she had been unfaithful, it was just another knife in my back. Then, one morning, my phone buzzed with a call from a private number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Richard's voice came through the line, thick with condescension. "Listen," he said. "You'll never see a cent of that money." I gripped the phone tighter. "You're a nobody," he continued, "and I'll use every legal trick in the book to make sure you walk away with nothing." I took a breath, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Actually, the prenup says otherwise." He let out a low, mocking laugh. "You really think that matters? I have lawyers, good ones. They know every judge in this town. By the time this is over, you'll be drowning in legal fees." His voice dropped lower. "Back off while you still can." I hung up, my hands shaking. Mr. Bennett had warned me about intimidation tactics. It was already starting. My father's words echoed in my head. "Document everything." I typed out the details of the call, sent it to my lawyer, and saved the voicemail as evidence. The next escalation came 2 days later. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, appeared outside my parents' house, perfectly dressed as always, her expression sharp. I have a proposal, she said, glancing around as if to make sure no one could hear. What is it? She handed me a paper with a dollar amount written on it. It was laughably low. Not even enough to cover half the mortgage payments I'd made on the condo. Take this and walk away, she said coolly. It's more than you deserve. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. You're joking, right? She stiffened. You come from a humble background. This is generous for someone like you. Why drag this into court? I tore the paper in half. No thanks, I said. See you in court. I took a step forward, my fists clenched at my sides. She stood in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes cold. How long? I asked, my voice low. She narrowed her eyes. What are you talking about? How long have you been with Jason? I pressed. The ex-co-worker. A flicker of something crossed her face. Guilt, maybe. Then, just as quickly, she masked it. That's none of your business. So you were sleeping with him while I was busting my ass working double shifts? My voice trembled, anger barely contained. She shot a quick glance at her father, who stood a few feet away, scowling. Then, leaning in close, she hissed. You have no idea what it was like being suffocated by your mediocrity. Jason understands me. He's successful. I felt my stomach drop. Interesting, I muttered, swallowing the bitterness rising in my throat. I was tired of waiting for you to catch up, she added, lifting her chin, defiant. My mouth went dry. So that's how you see me? A stepping stone. She gave a nonchalant shrug. I see you as someone who doesn't belong in my world. I exhaled sharply, steadying myself. Well, don't expect me to walk away empty-handed. Her expression sharpened. War? Really? She let out a small, humorless laugh. Fine. See you in court then. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked off, joining her parents. I stood there, my chest heaving, the pain in my ribs twisting like a knife. Richard, clearly enraged by my refusal to back down, wasted no time in trying to ruin me. He called my boss at the sporting goods store, suggesting that keeping me employed might complicate some upcoming business expansions. Fortunately, my boss wasn't easily intimidated. He had known me for years and simply told Richard to stay out of his affairs. My wife, however, wasn't done. That evening, I received a text from her. You can't keep mooching off decent people. Grow up and face reality. No one wants you around. My father's done playing nice. I stared at the message, my blood boiling. Then I forwarded it to Mr. Bennett without responding. Document everything. My father's voice echoed in my head. And don't stoop to their level. Weeks dragged by, the weight of it all pressing down on me. But I clung to one truth, the law was on my side. Mr. Bennett pored over every line of the prenup, combing through the fine print. One section, in particular, stood out. All financial windfalls acquired during the period of marriage, including, but not limited to, monetary prizes, lottery winnings, and game show prizes, shall be deemed marital property and subject to equitable distribution unless specifically excluded within this document. They had gone to great lengths to protect inherited wealth, trust funds, and family gifts, but they had never explicitly excluded lottery winnings. Their obsession with shielding their estate had left them vulnerable to an oversight they hadn't seen coming. Meanwhile, my wife and Jason were parading around town like they had nothing to hide. People whispered about them at high-end restaurants, exclusive clubs, and five-star hotels. One afternoon, my mother sighed as she stirred her coffee. Would you consider using her infidelity in court? Mr. Bennett shook his head. Our state is no-fault divorce. The cheating won't change the settlement. The prenup is the real goldmine here. I nodded. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about not letting them walk all over me. The final court date loomed, a black cloud on the horizon. Then, one night, barely a week before the hearing, my phone buzzed. It was nearly midnight. I had just finished reviewing documents with Carlson and was dozing in an armchair. I glanced at the screen. Her name. We hadn't spoken in weeks. Ever since she had thrown me out of my own home. My pulse quickened. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hello, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Hey! Her voice wavered, as if she were trying to sound casual, but couldn't quite pull it off. I waited. Can we talk? She asked hesitantly. A knot tightened in my gut. Talk about what exactly? She exhaled, the sound shaky. I don't want things to get ugly in court. Maybe we can work something out. Something that's fair for both of us. A bitter laugh escaped me. Fair? She and her family had done everything in their power to crush me. Now suddenly, she wanted fairness? Define fair, I said, my voice colder than I intended. She let out an impatient sigh. We can keep this private. Sign an NDA or something so the media and our social circles don't start talking. I rolled my eyes. Of course, it wasn't about fairness, it was about protecting their reputation. You'll get some money, she continued. More than what we offered before, but obviously a lot less than what your lawyer is asking for. That way, my parents don't have to be dragged into this, and you can walk away safe. There it was, the hush money, a pathetic attempt to buy my silence. A flicker of satisfaction ran through me. They were scared, but I also felt my anger surge. No thanks, I said flatly. I'm done negotiating behind closed doors. We'll see what the judge decides. She inhaled sharply, her composure cracking. You're an idiot, she snapped. Do you have any idea what my parents can do to you? If they pull the right strings, you'll never work in this city again. Hell, you won't work anywhere within 300 miles. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. The old fear threatened to creep in, but I refused to let it take hold. I guess I'll take that risk, I said. Goodbye. I ended the call before she could get another word in. For a moment, doubt gnawed at me. Was I making a mistake? Was I about to get blacklisted? Forced to start over somewhere new? Then I remembered the smug way Richard had sneered at me. The cold dismissal in my wife's eyes as she tossed me aside. The way they had tried to strip me of everything and expected me to just accept it. No more fear. I was in this fight until the end. The morning of the final hearing arrived under gray, rain-heavy clouds. I pulled on my best suit, not designer, but sharp enough. My mother fussed over my tie, whispering, "We believe in you." Outside the courthouse, I met Carlson. We exchanged a brief, firm nod. My parents hung back, watching with quiet support. This was my battle to fight. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with tension. Lawyers, clerks, and petitioners moved through the halls, the air thick with anticipation. Then I saw her. She sat on a hallway bench, perfectly poised in a tailored blazer and pencil skirt. Her father stood behind her, arms crossed, his expression tight. Eleanor was there too, murmuring in her ear, her gaze flicking toward me with open disdain. For attorneys hovered around them, sifting through thick folders and whispering among themselves. My wife met my eyes briefly, then turned away, flipping her hair in that practiced, dismissive way. I knew the story she had spun. In her version, I was the villain, the gold-digging, useless husband trying to leech off of her success. Mr. Bennett touched my elbow. Let's go. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Rows of wooden benches lined the space. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, took her seat. She rapped the gavel. We're here to determine the equitable distribution of marital assets in the divorce proceedings of... She read our names, scanning our faces. I forced my shoulders back, ignoring the knot in my stomach. My wife's attorney stood. The lottery ticket, he began, was purchased independently with her personal funds. The money was never intended to be shared. I exhaled slowly. Here we go. Mr. Bennett rose to his feet, his voice steady and composed. With all due respect, Your Honor, we have irrefutable proof that my client's wife used a joint debit card, an account with both their names, to purchase the winning lottery ticket. He let that sink in before continuing. Furthermore, the prenuptial agreement clearly designates lottery winnings as marital assets. The judge raised an eyebrow and motioned for him to submit the documents. As Carlson handed them over, I caught the slightest twitch in my father-in-law's jaw. My wife, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice carried a defensive edge. "I never meant to cheat him," she said quickly. "My parents were just worried about opportunists. Things escalated, and I was under a lot of pressure. I'm sorry if it felt abrupt." Felt abrupt? She had thrown me onto the street without a word of warning. I clenched my jaw but stayed silent. The judge peered at her over the rim of her glasses, unimpressed. Then her father's lawyer took a different approach, aggressive, cutting. "Your Honor, this man contributed virtually nothing to the household," he argued, gesturing toward me. "His residence in the condominium was entirely dependent on my client's father's generous down payment. In essence, he freeloaded off their family wealth. We respectfully ask that the court recognize he has no rightful claim." Freeloader. The word cut deeper than I expected. Carlson, unfazed, responded with practiced ease. "We have receipts for mortgage payments, utility bills, and household expenses, all of which my client contributed to for years," he countered. Far from freeloading, he carried far more of the financial burden than they're willing to admit. The courtroom became a battlefield of paperwork and arguments. Each claim met with an immediate counterattack. Tension crackled in the air. I could feel the weight of my wife's glare. Her parents' loathing burned into my back like twin daggers. By late afternoon, the judge tapped her gavel lightly. "I want silence in this courtroom," she said firmly. The murmuring ceased, and the attorneys lowered their pens. She picked up the prenuptial agreement, her lips curving in a wry smirk. "After reviewing the language of this document," she began, "it is clear that any financial windfall obtained during the marriage, including lottery winnings, is considered marital property and therefore subject to equitable distribution. This court finds no ambiguity in that." A hush fell over the room. Richard's jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists. My wife blinked rapidly, color draining from her face. The judge turned her focus to her. "Additionally, you evicted your spouse from the condominium without due notice or legal process, despite his substantial financial contributions to the household. That action was not only unjust but is also legally relevant to the court's ruling." Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a fleeting smirk from Carlson before he quickly masked it. The judge delivered the final blow. "Therefore, the court rules that the lottery winnings shall be equitably divided, with a significant portion awarded to the petitioner. Furthermore, the petitioner is entitled to reimbursement for his share of the mortgage, utilities, and other marital expenses he covered." It was everything we had fought for. Relief surged through me, but I kept my expression neutral. The judge's final words echoed like a hammer striking steel. "We will reconvene, if necessary, for final calculations. That is my ruling." Court adjourned. The gavel struck, the bailiff called for all rise, and we stood. I felt lightheaded. The war was over. The moment the judge exited, the room erupted in murmured chaos. A handful of local reporters, stationed outside for gossip, pressed forward, eager to catch a glimpse of the fallout. Richard stormed toward me, his face an alarming shade of red. "This isn't over," he seethed. "You have no idea what we can still do. We'll appeal. We'll—" I squared my shoulders. "It is over," I interrupted. The judge decided. My wife stood off to the side, her arms wrapped around herself. Tears glistened in her eyes, but they weren't from sorrow. They were pure rage. Behind her, Eleanor whispered furiously in her ear. Carlson touched my arm. "We should go," he murmured. "Let them self-destruct on their own." But before I could move, my wife lunged at me. "You worthless scum!" she shrieked, her face contorted in fury. She swung her purse at me. I ducked just in time, but she still managed to claw at my sleeve. The bailiff and a security officer rushed in, forcing themselves between us. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the bailiff warned. Richard's stunned voice rang out. "What the hell are you doing? Stop it!" But she was beyond reason. Tears streamed down her face as she spat venom at me. "You think you've won?" she shrieked. "You're a parasite who fooled everyone. A gold-digging liar." I stumbled back, adrenaline spiking. I had never seen her like this before, not even during our worst fights. My mother gasped audibly from across the aisle. Carlson instinctively stepped in front of me, hands raised slightly as if shielding me. The security officer grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, calm down, or we'll have to remove you." She thrashed against his grip. "Let go of me," she screamed. "He's stealing from me. How can you people allow this? Do you know who my father is?" The officer yanked her back. "Enough," he said. "Court is over. We don't tolerate violence here." Her lawyer scrambled forward, hands raised in a useless attempt to de-escalate. The bailiff, unimpressed, waved for additional security. "She assaulted him in open court," he announced. "That's contempt." Richard looked horrified, caught between protecting his daughter and realizing she had just destroyed what little dignity they had left. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth. My wife spat on the floor, still trembling with rage. "He's the one who used me," she howled. "He married me for money. He's the villain, not me." I stood there, heart pounding, staring at what we had become. A shattered marriage. A spectacle for all to witness. Security dragged her toward the hallway, where the judge's chambers were located. I could hear her muffled screams through the thick walls as she fought against them. Richard stormed after them, demanding they release her. Carlson exhaled sharply. "Well, that was unexpected." My mother rushed to my side. "Are you all right?" I nodded, though my voice felt hollow. "I'm fine." Minutes later, a bailiff approached. "The judge has issued an immediate contempt ruling," he informed me. "She'll be fined for assaulting you in court, and she'll remain in custody until processed." He studied me. "Do you wish to press additional charges?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to, but another part pitied her. She was losing everything because of her own arrogance. "No," I said finally. "The court's punishment is enough." The bailiff nodded. "Understood." A few days later, once the dust had settled, I found myself back at the attorney's office for the final settlement. Richard scowled. My ex-wife sat stiffly, her swollen eyes refusing to meet mine. The arrogance was gone, replaced by silent defeat. Eleanor whispered furiously to their lawyer. The check slid across the table. A large sum. The final release of condo claims. I signed without hesitation. Carlson reviewed it all before nodding. "Congratulations," he murmured. My ex-wife scrawled her name across the last document, her lips pressed into a tight line. Richard shoved the check toward me. "Take it. Hope you're happy." I glanced at them. No one spoke another word. The settlement was done. No one said goodbye. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like.